We're right. I'm gonna start letting folks in. There's about 6 people, I think, in the waiting room.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes. We've got a number of RSVPs and a little light on participants. So we'll give it just a couple more minutes and then we'll get started with our program. Thank you so much for joining us. All right. Well, thank you, Amber, for letting us know that there may be some confusion about our start time. So we're going to go ahead and start. And we're going to send out an email to the folks that registered and let them know that we're starting now. And so hopefully we'll get an influx of people. We'll start with introductions. My name is Kat Brooks. Some of you know me in my role as the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project and also the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. Both of those organizations are focused on eradicating state terror. We do that through policy, organizing, communications, and developing alternative models to community crisis that don't lead with law enforcement. In this capacity, however, I am with Three Girls Theater Company. Three Girls Theater, the program that I oversee with Three Girls Theater is Three Girls Theater Investigates. And it is a program for BIPOC playwrights, BIPOC women playwrights, to use investigative theater techniques to look into issues that are impacting our communities, our time, are relevant, that allow us to tell stories that are about us, utilizing our voices, right? Oftentimes, our stories are told on our behalves. They are told for us. In regards to some of the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight, those issues are sensationalized, sexualized. And so we really see this as a powerful platform for us to be able to tell our stories. Three Girls Theater specifically committed to providing platforms for women playwrights over 40, to tell our stories. I want to thank Three Girls Theater for this opportunity. AJ Baker, who's the founder of Three Girls Theater, is with us tonight. AJ, say hi. Are you saying hi?
Hi. Sorry, I can't figure out how to unmute and unvideo.
There she is. That's
Hi,
AJ.
everyone. Thank you all for coming.
I met AJ, several years ago now as an actress with the show that we did called Low Hanging Fruit. And we liked each other a lot. And so we've been in a relationship ever since. I blame AJ actually for me delving deeper into my career as a playwright.
Very happy to take on that burden.
And I've been really fortunate to be able to work with AJ and the other amazing folks. I also want to say thank you to Zach, who is running our tech and who does all the back end things that make all of the things happen and work, including manage my crazy life to make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do when I'm supposed to do it. And Hannah, our comms person, who's responsible for the beautiful flyer you saw and a lot of the social media posts that went out about this event. So the way that actually I got involved with Three Girls Investigates was an offer to be one of the playwrights that got to do some investigation. And at the time that I was having that conversation with AJ, a stat came out, and I don't remember why it came out. I don't remember what the news story was. Maybe our panelists will remember, but a number came out that 64,000 Black women and girls were missing in America. And nobody knew where they were or why they were missing. And more importantly, nobody was talking about it. And just as quickly as that conversation happened, the 24-hour soundbite on mainstream media, it went away and nobody was talking about it anymore. At that time also, I was delving deeper into one of Oakland's pandemics. And that is the fact that there are 12, 13, 14-year-old Black girls for sale in broad daylight, 7 days a week, 365 days a year on what we call E14 or the Blade. Again, nobody was talking about it. And so those two things sort of collided for me. And the story that I wanted to tell was about Black women and girls in Oakland. And so we tentatively named the project Black Murdered, Missing, and Trafficked, BMMT. We've since then evolved to calling it Surviving Oakland. And the project is in partnership with Dr. Ayodele Nzinga, who is the founder of Lower Bottom Players, as well as Black Arts Movement Business District, CDC. I anticipate she will be joining us at some point in time this evening. Her schedule is even, there's the doctor. Project in partnership with this amazing woman who I do a lot of my writing and arting with. And so we began to delve into these different strands, right? Delving into the world of missing Black girls and women in Oakland, delving into the world of trafficked Black girls in Oakland, and delving into the world of murdered Black girls in Oakland. We like to keep it light around these parts. And so we have developed a script. COVID put an interesting wrench in us being able to actually push things forward, but those things are moving. We'll be filming the script this summer, and hopefully all of you will take first pass at looking at our project and giving us feedback as we continue to develop the piece. Dr. Nzinga, are you ready to say hi to people?
Good evening. I'm so happy to be able to join this illustrious group of women on this rather heavy topic, but something that's really important for us to talk about and pull out of the shadows. I think one of the most egregious things about what's happening to Black women and girls is that it's all happening in silence. And indeed, it does matter. And so excited about this conversation this evening.
Folks hopefully you're tracking, I imagine you're tracking, and that may be why you're attracted to this conversation. But when we started this project, we weren't having this particular piece of the conversation the way we're having it right now. So last year in 2020, Oakland saw a 47% spike in homicides. This year, we are only in, geez, what month is it? May. And we are at 58 homicides. One of the things that struck me as those numbers continued to roll through was an unusually high number of Black women and girls that were being caught in the crossfire. Most recently, folks will remember the 2 teenage girls that were shot and killed as they were on a party bus in Oakland. And so as part of our conversations, we wanted to unpack that. Of course, all of this is happening under a backdrop of a national conversation that Oakland is very much leading about defunding the police, and also how do we redefine and how do we shift the way we implement public safety, right? And does the violence of policing and the carceral state keep us any safer? The data would say no, right? The data would say that our communities are not safer, and the data would say that if we could incarcerate our way to a safer world, we would be the safest country on the planet, because we do that more than any other country on the globe and more than several developed countries combined. So we're gonna have some of that conversation tonight too. You wanna introduce, do you have the bios in front of you, or you want me to keep going?
You need to keep us going, please.
Okay. I want to stop talking so much. We have 2 brilliant women joining us this evening. First, I want to introduce Dr. Nikki Jones. Nikki Jones is professor and incoming chair of the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. She's a Black feminist scholar and author of 2 books, The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, winner of the American Society of Criminology's Outstanding Book Award in 2020, and Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence. Her 40+ publications include edited volumes, articles, essays, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, book reviews, blog posts, and op-eds. Professor Jones has appeared on CNN's The Lead with Jake Tapper and United Shades of America with W. Kamau Bell, and is frequently cited, excuse me, in local, national, and international news outlets as an expert on race, violence, and policing. She's lived in the Bay Area for 14 years and has called Oakland home since 2010. Welcome, Dr. Nikki Jones.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Really happy to have you here. And then we are also joined by Dr. Aisha Mays. Dr. Mays is a family physician who focuses on adolescent medicine. She's the founder and medical director of the Dream Youth Clinics of Roots Community Health Center in Oakland, California. Dr. Mays' work centers on adolescent reproductive health, reproductive justice for highly vulnerable youth, and the health risks associated with childhood commercial sexual exploitation. Dr. Mays' research focuses on exploring reproductive justice barriers and supporting sexual health for youth who have been affected by commercial sexual exploitation. Good morning, Dr. Mays. Good evening, Dr. Mays. Woo.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
It's just like my morning never ended. Okay, I want to start with opening remarks from each of you. Dr. Nikki, we'll start with you. And that is wanting you to unpack what we mean when we say violence is a public health issue, and specifically, of course, through the lens of the Black community, and even more specifically through the lens of Black women and girls.
Thank you. Thank you again, Kat, for the invitation to be here and to all the work that you and the folks that you work with are doing in Oakland. And that's having a national impact, global impact on the conversation around defunding and reimagining safety. And it is great to be here, Dr. Mays as well. And thanks to all whose invisible labor has contributed to pulling this event off tonight, and to all of you who are listening in or listening in on the recording. So just, a couple of comments to open up with as I'm thinking about how I enter into this conversation. Kat, you mentioned the first book that I published, Between Good and Ghetto, African-American Girls and Inner City Violence, that was based in neighborhoods in Philadelphia. I started doing field work on that book in 2001. The book was published, it was my dissertation, and the book was published in 2009. And I'm working on a second edition now. And I say all that to say that, one, when I was writing the dissertation, people said, choose something that you can talk about for the next 10 years. Now we're about 20 years out, and I knew that I could continue to talk about Black girls and their safety for 10 years. And certainly that I'm still talking about it 20 years out, and that I'm doing this work and that you all are doing this work is a testament to the conditions under which I was talking and engaging with young people in the early 2000s, right, on the dawn of a new century. And so those conditions for Black communities, and we see that in the rates of violence, and certainly for the experiences of Black women and girls, hasn't changed in any fundamental way. Testament to that is that I can have girls come up to me now, young women. I remember after graduation, Berkeley's Black graduation, a student came up to me and said, I saw myself in your book, right? And this is a student, right, who is coming of age in a different moment, but she could see herself. And again, that is because of the conditions then are quite similar, or now are quite similar to the conditions then. And it's that story is connected to a larger story that is the experience of Black women and girls, right? That story of how we stay safe, right? And that's really the story of the book. And so, so in addition to wanting and being in a position to continue to talk about the experiences of Black women and girls, I also want to speak to what you mentioned about the silence, right? And so there is a silence always in some ways, and what we know from the work that you are doing, right, and the work that we do each day is that people are talking about this all the time. We are always trying to figure out how to do this work, how to stay safe, how to address the very, kind of the problems that we confront each day, the threats to our safety that we confront each day. And we're often doing that in community. And so I just want also to speak to the importance of the work that you're doing when it comes to expressive culture and telling these stories. So even though we're telling them again and again, even though these are the stories that make up, right, the canon of Black feminist thought, they need to be told again and again, right? And that is the tradition really that we are all connected to. And a point, to get to the point about violence and what we're seeing out there and thinking about it, how we frame violence and how we think about violence, a point that I was making early on is that the violence, and at that point, it was the violence of the 90s that people were really concerned about and moving into the early part of the 21st century. And there's a way that people talked about the violence as if women and girls just weren't around, right? Like they weren't around when people were getting shot, right? They weren't victims of violence, that somehow they were buffered by virtue of gender from the violence that was happening in their homes, in their schools, in their neighborhoods, right? And so I think that what we know now, and part of what we see in these tragic cases of young people, young women caught in the crossfire, is that gender is not a buffer, and gender has never been a buffer for Black women and girls in the way that has been for white women, right? And so we understand that. And so what we need to do, and what I've tried to push people to do in my work, and I know other folks do this as well, is to have a broader vision of what violence is, how it impacts our lives, how it's all connected, right? And the ways in which gender makes some people more vulnerable to certain forms of violence, but does not protect anyone, right? Does not protect people in Black communities from violence entirely. And so when we think about violence, one of the things that I've moved into more recently in thinking very seriously about the arguments, in the analysis in my first book, is to think about how state violence shows up as gendered violence, always, right? And so that violence is gendered when it is targeted at a cisgendered Black boy, right, through the hands of the police. That violence is gendered when it's targeted at a trans woman, a Black woman. That violence is always gendered. And that violence doesn't stay, right, in one place, right? That state violence moves through our bodies, our minds, onto other people, including other people, I should say, that we care deeply about. And so when we think about violence, when we think about violence, particularly in Black communities, and I'm going to wrap up here so Dr. Mays has some space to contribute to as well. When we think about violence, we often think about it as an individual act, right? Something that's located within the body or the mind of a person. And then we have pathological stories that we tell, right? The stories of pathology that we tell, particularly when it comes to violence in Black communities. And what I would push us to think about is how that violence that is that it manifests is actually a consequence of a larger system of power, a larger system of violence, right? And so that institutional violence, structural violence is coming out as interpersonal violence, and that violence is gendered. But if we understand that it's not just an individual act, then we understand that our approach, our response, our intervention can't just be at the level of the individual, right? It has to be at the level of the group, of the community, and it has to identify, it has to target, right, those systems of power and oppression that create the conditions for violence. So I'll stop there. We can have some follow-up on that, but yeah.
Dr. Mays.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I hope you all can hear me okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for your words too. And it's maybe gave me a lot to think about as well. And I just also want to just express my gratitude for being a part of this panel and this community tonight to talk about this issue that is so near and dear to my heart, working with Black girls and working with girls in our community and working with just some of the most vulnerable folks in our community that sort of shape our entire community. And I just want to sort of express a little bit about sort of my work and kind of my journey and how I came to this and what I have learned along the way that is going to help to sort of unpack this first question. So I've been working with young people in Oakland my entire career. And always really want to work with young people who sort of need it the most and sort of in our community. And have worked in the Oakland Public Schools and at the juvenile hall. I used to be the medical director at the juvenile hall here in Alameda County. And it was through that experience at juvenile hall that I really started to learn about and sort of connections with young people and young girls in particular, and some of their relationships. And we'll talk about some of those relationships and how young people, some of our young people have some of the relationships that they're in that put them in certain situations that cause them to be more vulnerable to violence. But it was in starting the Dream Youth Clinics as part of Roots Community Health Center, which are co-located in the youth shelters in downtown Oakland. So we're in the Dreamcatcher Youth Shelter for young people ages 13 to 18, and the Covenant House Youth Shelter for young people ages 18 to 24. it was really through that experience. And when I came to Dream and came to Open Dream with young people, I felt very seasoned at that point, and knew sort of how it was with working with young people. But has really been through this experience that I have come to understand what intersectionality really means, and how that is impacting every fabric of the lives of our young people, and how that weaves into even their own lives and the multi-generational impact of their lives. We have a lot of young people who have children. And so our young people who have children who are exposed to violence or living in, being subjected to living in conditions where they have to choose violent situations in order to survive, in order to thrive, because they're trying to take care of their children, and the multi-generational impacts that we're seeing today based on some of the decisions that they have to make for their safety. So sometimes our young people are choosing violence in order to be safe in the long term, in order to keep their children safe in the long term, and making these really hard decisions every day. So when I think about violence as a public health issue, I really think about it from this intersectional lens, that our girls are not living in silos. They're not living in these spaces where they are making choices based on one thing. They're making the choices based on having to deal with not being able to find a job that pays them enough money to be able to care for themselves, because our young people are always working, but it's not making enough money to care for themselves. Not having safe housing or stable housing to be able to care for themselves and their children and their families. Not having adequate healthcare that does not discriminate against them, because they are a young person showing up as a young person and showing up as a young person with a child. And so they're having to make choices in light of all of those intersectional challenges, in addition to the violence that they may be experiencing every day. So when I think about overall violence as a public health issue, it makes me think about the intersectional challenges that our girls are living in, and sometimes having to choose being in situations that are violent in order to live, in order to care for themselves and care for their families.
Dr. Nzinga, any follow-up questions from you?
So, Nikki, could you speak more about the communal nature of violence, and perhaps both sides of the community? Who actually is harmed when a young person is subject to a violent act?
I think that, one of the things that we've learned from the last year, for those of us who weren't tuned into that before, for example, the murder of George Floyd, is how diffuse the consequences of a violent act are for an entire community. And so if we think back to the video so bravely captured by Darnella Frazier and what it's focused on, right? We see Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd, but we know the violence is not contained there, right? That violence, right, was experienced by what was described as the bouquet of humanity around it, right? And so from children on to elders. And from my experience, that's also what happens in communities, right? And so whether that violence is police violence, interpersonal violence, gender-specific violence, intimate violence, domestic violence, it has ripple effects, right? It has consequences. And the power hierarchy around age, gender, right? That influences who's most likely to be vulnerable to that violence, who's most likely to experience, and who might be the perpetrator, right? But that violence is not contained within one act. And that's one of the reasons why using violence, for example, the violence of policing instead of a public health approach, does such harm, right? Because you are using violence in response to violence. you are often doing it in an extractive way and taking people out of communities without actually addressing the underlying problem or the underlying conditions that give rise to violence. Right. And so we are trapped in cities across the country in this battle, in this belief that somehow we can use violence to end violence, right? Where, you know, as Kat said at the top, if that was going to happen, it would have happened by now. We are at the end of that experiment, and we are doing more violence and harm. And we see that in the health data that's coming out now, and the research that people are doing, just really powerful work that people are doing, showing the consequences of not only of being a victim of violence, but even as a kid living in a neighborhood where there are high rates of violence. What's the consequence of that? Living in a neighborhood that is aggressively policed, what are the consequences of that? It extends from the home to the school, right? And everywhere in between. And so I think if we can understand and this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking through over the course of my career, is that how expansive violence is and the various forms it takes and the ways in which these are interconnected, right? Then we understand that one solution, for example, like policing, that's not going to solve the problem. We need a larger array of responses. And an array of responses that addresses the harm that's done to people who do harm, right? And this is something that many of us, on this call know and understand. And so when I say, for example, that, when we think about the communities that are living under such precarity, there's a vulnerability to violence. And there, are some folks who may be more likely to experience some forms of violence, but that doesn't mean that other people don't experience it entirely. So I think about this when I think about sexual violence, for example, right? So we know that Black men and boys also experience sexual violence, right? But we don't talk about it, right? And we don't talk about the sexual violence that Black women and girls experience, right? And so there's a silence around that. And so what would happen if we talked about sexual violence as a problem, right? And the various ways it impacts people across the gender spectrum, but we centered that shared vulnerability to violence, to sexual violence, to police violence, to various forms of violence. So that's kind of a space where I've been spending some time in my own thoughts thinking about that. But to get to the question, thinking about how diffuse this violence is when it occurs in communities. It sends ripple effects through communities and through generations, and we know that as well now.
Dr. Mays, is there anything that you'd like to add there? Because I imagine in your role as a physician, you see the ripple effect of that violence, intergenerational, through the family unit, and then of course, through the work specifically at Roots, the way that then that ripples through community.
Yes, we absolutely do, and I echo everything that Nikki said. We see the ripple effects, and we also see that by only focusing on a law enforcement solution, we also have taken the responsibility out of community. We've taken the responsibility away from community and other interdisciplinary departments to actually center safety. So we've taken the responsibility away from healthcare. We've taken the responsibility away from schools. We've taken a responsibility away from places of worship and religious centers to actually center safety and community. If we actually really implore a public health approach, the responsibility is on all those pieces of community to center safety. So if we continue to focus on violence, then we expect to have violence. If we center safety and we actually make it a interdisciplinary, intercommunal response and responsibility for safety, we can then center safety, and then we have different checkpoints around who is going to be responsible for that safety, and it's a community approach. We certainly see the multi-generational impacts of violence. We see it in young children and experiencing that from family members being taken out of the home, being imprisoned for years. That's a form of violence. We also see the violence that young people are experiencing in education. We see how the impact on them in that way. We also see the need for overall sort of community healing. So when we think about young people, sort of going back to the girls who were killed in May, and thinking about also now what's happening in their homes. And so how is that affecting their families and the need for healing in the family? So how is that story going to be told to their young niece or young nephew about what happened to their auntie or what happened to their cousin? That is how this trauma continues. If we only center a police response in addressing violence and not centering safety, then we can only expect to, again, to have what we continue to have. We really have to take it more upstream and also have a more community response with community obligation, from a multidisciplinary approach of obligation to really be able to center safety so that we actually have safer communities.
Can I just
Oh, no, go, please.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what Dr. Mays was laying out there, because it reminds me of how important the questions we ask are, how important how we frame the problem and what we even imagine of the problem is. And so when I was, doing this work on Between Good and Ghetto early on, people were really like hyper concerned about girls fighting, right? It was like the mean queen bee wannabe era. Right. And they were concerned about middle-class white girls, right, getting violent, right? They weren't really concerned about Black girls living in tough neighborhoods, but I was. And I didn't want to ask the question, well, why do girls fight, right? Which was the question that people were like obsessed with, right? So our girls are fighting, they're cutting each other. Are they going to use weapons? Are they going to use guns? The question I asked is, how do girls stay safe, right? You ask the question, how do girls stay safe? You see that violence, the use of violence, in just the ways that you were just saying, Dr. Mays, that the use of violence is one way in which at times girls try and keep themselves safe. But there are an array of other things that they do as well. And so when we think about what our response should be as the adults in various institutions, our response should be in part to support those other ways in which they're trying to stay safe, so that violence or the use of violence or staying in violent context is not the best option that they have in front of them.
Dr. Nzinga, yeah, go ahead.
So we're skirting around talking about institution here. Can we get inside of an institution for a moment? Dr. Mays, could you talk to us about the experience of Black females in school, where a lot of violence actually exists, and what does that look like, and what pipelines does that create?
Oh, yes, thank you for this question. I can think about, it's making me think about the multi-layered violence that girls experience in school. We know that Monique Morris published a great book and film, Push Out, about the violence that young people experience, that girls particularly experience in school. And I will start with the violence that they experience from the educational system that has put them in a box around sort of how they show up as individuals, how they assert themselves as individuals, how they speak, how they relate to one another, how they relate to their teacher, the violence that they're experiencing just showing up to school every day, and what that does to ostracize young people. I've had girls talk to me in my exam rooms about how they don't like going to school because of how they're treated by the teacher or treated by the school system, just in their own sort of personhood and how they show up every day, and how they notice the difference between other peers, comparing to their white peers or their peers of other races. So just the violence that's showing up as a Black girl in school, number one, is something that is a real issue. And then for other young women, I'm using, piggybacking on what Nikki was saying about how girls have to figure out how they're going to be safe, getting to school, getting to that school, being able to engage in school with other young people. I always steer away from sort of blaming young folks for the tools that they're using to be safe and to assert themselves and to assert their voice, because often we don't teach young people how to do that in a way that centers their safety and where they're actually able to expand and center their agency. So often we don't give young people tools around how to resolve conflict outside of asserting their agency and maybe being physical. So being able to sort of talk through that. We don't often give young people the tools to do that, but then we expect them to do that and we penalize them when they're not able to. So I stay away from that, although we know that we see that in our schools. So I think that we need to sort of, again, go back and think about who are the educators who are charged with teaching our young people to be adults, because that's what they're really learning in school. They're spending most of their time with other folks. So who are the educators that we are charging to teach our young people, and how are they doing that, and how are they centering and affirming Black girls to be who they are, the way that they show up, and affirming them in their agency.
If I could stick in one more question, Gat. So we know that Black girls are disciplined second only to Black boys in educational spaces. And one of the pipelines, that institutional pipelines, lead from educational spaces to being pushed out and eventually to the carceral system. So this question is for both of you. And if Nikki, if you could take a swipe at it first, could you talk about violence against Black women and girls that start off in school and then they end up in carceral systems? What is the view of the carceral system through the lens of a Black woman or Black girl?
I think that, you know, what we know from a body of Black feminist thought is that this experience of surveillance of one's behavior and one's actions, this experience of carcerality begins early on in the life of a Black girl, right? And we could think of the kind of gender policing that happens and the kind of femininity and kind of ideas about respectable femininity that Black girls might be socialized into and then are penalized. And that can start in the home, in the neighborhood, in the school, right, for not being a particular kind of girl, right? And so when we have, you know, those kind of gender ideologies, which aren't specific to Black people, right? So there are mainstream ideologies about what makes a girl a good girl, right? Or a woman a good woman. And certainly there's a history within, you know, the Black community as well around that. And so once you're in a school setting, that policing doesn't stop, right? And because it's an institution, there are different sets of sanctions and punishments that can bear down as a consequence of not being seen as a good girl in the classroom, either because of what your hair looks like, right? Or your skin color looks like, or how loud you are, right? Or how, or your presence, right? And so, you know, I write that it's easy to punish the girl who doesn't look or act like a good girl. And that was my experience when I was doing that work. And what I've seen unfold is that those girls who are perceived to be pushing on gender expectations, right, are the ones who were punished, right? And so when Dr. Mays is talking about what adults and teachers need to do in the classroom, right, we need to investigate the expectations that we are bringing into the classroom around how young people, how Black girls, young Black girls, right, ought to act and interrogate that. And certainly when you extend that out from the school to the juvenile justice system or to the adult system, we understand that in the history of punishment systems in relation to women and girls is that the idea is that these institutions are to, one, punish you for not meeting those expectations, not being a good girl or a respectable lady, and then teach you how to do it, right? And so we also know that Black girls and women were excluded from those institutions early on, right? And subject to other kinds of labor, including labor on the convict lease system, including domestic servitude, being leased to a domestic servant. So they were outside of those systems, right? Until really one of the most punitive moments in our history, right? And then you begin to see the numbers of youth, Black girls increase, right, in these systems. And you certainly saw that in the 90s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, where you had what folks call the net widening effect. And now girls who are in schools and are doing things like fighting, and they might be fighting because they're trying to stay safe, right, are punished and enter now, because of the policing that's happening in schools, into juvenile justice systems, which then increases the likelihood that they'll enter into adult systems. And so what we have is that intersection, right, of this kind of policing that many of us are exposed to, many we don't necessarily age out of, right? And the institution that has the power to punish, right, and is deeply invested in that project. Which is one of the reasons why we ought to not have cops in schools, right? If we hear what Dr. Mays is saying, what we need are teachers, counselors, coaches. We need caretakers in schools, right, that can address the many challenges and concerns that young people bring in, right? But we have invested, most recently, in a different kind of adult resource in schools, right? We've invested more in cops and those other kinds of resources. Yeah, so I'll stop there unless you want me to keep going.
Let's give Dr. Mays a chance at it.
I think I love what Dr. Jones says, and I think just to add to that, I think that just piggybacking on this punitive nature that we have thread into public schools, right? So when we think about the public school system, and certainly our public school system in our large cities, in any urban city, going to any urban city, and the public school system will always have officers there, and this very sort of punitive energy in that space. And we know that that Black youth, Black girls are penalized at higher rates than white youth and youth of other races for the same thing, right? So it's the same parallel that we see for Black people and Black women and Black men being penalized and through the legal system at higher rates for the same sort of offense as other folks. And so again, it's starting that pipeline. I think the other thing that we also see is not only the reaction to Black girls when they assert themselves, but we also see this this ignoring of Black girls too. So either there's this reaction toward them when they're not doing something you don't like, or Black girls are just ignored in the educational system. So ignored could be that they're not affirmed for the things that they do. They're not affirmed for doing well on the test or for running for that office. They're just ignored. And so what negligence can also do to the spirit, right? What negligence can also do to a young person's development, it can also create rage. Negligence can create rage in the same way that overt violence can create rage. That negligence can also lead young people right into the penal system, right into that punitive system, because sometimes in the stages of adolescent development, it might feel better to have a negative reaction than no reaction at all. So I think we need to also think about how Black girls are also being ignored in the educational system. And the last thing, a lot of my work really focuses on supporting young people with children, and young people who choose to parent. And we know that we often see rates in the United States of Black girls choosing to parent. We don't necessarily see higher pregnancy rates, but we do see higher parenting rates. So we know that Black girls and white girls and all girls are getting pregnant at similar rates, but we do see that Black girls are choosing to parent their children at higher rates. they're also penalized for that as well in the educational system. So either overtly, where there are comments and looks, or being asked to leave school, leave their school of origin to go to another school once they become visibly pregnant, or they're again sent off to another school, or they're just not treated well in that school. It's a setup, like they are assumed to fail because they have chosen to parent. It's another way that we are sort of threading in this sort of violence that can then lead to these very negative, long-lasting outcomes, which can include the carceral system for our Black girls.
I want, and I'm going to throw this to both of you, but I want to parse out some more the second half of the question that Dr. Nzinga just asked, and that's around the pipelines that it creates, the violence that Black girls experience in school, at home, but particularly let's stay with the school system for now. I mean, that's where our kids spend the vast majority of their time, right? School, well, pre-COVID, school saw more of my child than I did. And go back to that epidemic that the three of us are screaming about, the four of us are screaming about, but our chorus is small. And that's, the school we talk about the school to prison pipeline. I want to spend some time talking about the school to the track pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a powerful one as well. And I appreciate you saying that. And so we think about how young people, how our girls are being introduced to exploitation, introduced to being used, and being coerced into being exploited. It is, and I'm probably, talking to the choir here. We know that it can feel very innocuous, and it can feel very subtle, and so subtle that sometimes our young people don't realize what's happening. Sometimes our girls don't realize what's happening. And when I have conversations with friends and colleagues about this, they're often shocked by something that can seem so overt, where there's a young girl who actually is going out and standing on the streets. And we know that the track exists on international. It also exists on the web. It exists in these back rooms. It's not just visibly on the streets, but let's use the most sort of stark contrast. So even for young people who are now out on international, on the track, they sometimes don't even realize what's happening. And that is how this weave of exploitation can happen. And taking it back to the educational system and the impact that the educational system can have on perpetuating that is, again, this push out that can happen to Black girls that picks away at the self-esteem, that picks away at their notion of what they can do. So when they're now being chipped away at school, and there may be some challenges at home. And again, I also don't also like to liken the Black family to a struggle, because sometimes it's just that mom is not here because mom is working, or dad is not here because dad is working, not because there's some conflict at home, but because, again, trying to make ends meet and make sure that folks are taken care of, but also that young person not having enough of what they might need, not because of anyone's fault, but not enough of what they might need at home. That's picking away. And so now meeting a young, let's say a male, meeting a man in the stage of adolescent development, where young people are. And during that stage of development, it's when we're creating relationships and we're having sort of our first intimate relationships. When you've been picked away, it's very easy for someone to tell you something, to make you believe something about yourself or about the conditions of your relationship, that then takes that young person outside to the track, to the internet, doing things that they may not feel good about, but may feel like that it's important for their relationship. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'll just echo the theme of invisibility and exclusion and how that's handled in schools. And I'm thinking here about the work of a former student of mine, Kenley Brown, Dr. Kenley Brown, who's now at Washington University at St. Louis and runs a Black girlhood studies lab there. And she wrote a really powerful dissertation and is now turning that into a book that engages with some of these themes. And one of the key takeaways is that before this moment and before or as that drift is happening, there are so many opportunities for adults to intervene, for teachers to see, right, what is right in front of them. A girl who is not showing up in the same way, a girl whose mood has changed, a girl who has some absences and is coming in and out as indicators of a need for help and for engagement, but that they're ignored, that the school isn't structured to see that, and the school isn't structured to address that, which then increases a girl's vulnerability, right, to the market that exists to sexualize Black girls and Black women that exists, broadly, right, here and globally, right? And so that market exists out there, and this kind of patterns of that invisibility and exclusion increases that vulnerability to that. I'm also thinking about a scene, and she shared in that dissertation about how girls are propositioned that resonated with a scene that I write about, 20 years earlier in Between Good and Ghetto, and that some of us maybe remember from our own childhood, right? Just walking down the street and hearing a horn beep, right? And looking over, and that's an older man beeping that horn at you, right? And the scene from Kenley's dissertation is someone in an ice cream truck propositioning a young woman, right? Who has already moved through this trajectory of some trauma in her life, right? Being pushed out, right? Or being in other ways. And so, thinking seriously about, it just really resonates what you were saying, that's thinking seriously about the consequences of invisibility, right? And what we don't see.
I'm going to stay here for just a little while longer, and two things. One, and this ties back to what we were talking about earlier, to a certain degree. Yes, the schools aren't set up to see, right? Wherever you want to put the responsibility for that setup at, but they're also set up to criminalize, right? So you're talking about the girl that shows up to school in a different way, or is not showing up, as often as she should, or whose homework is lapsing, whatever the signals are. It's either invisibilized or criminalized, right? Further exacerbating the initial issue. And then the second thing that your response to, if you so choose, if these were blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girls that were being sold, right? That were being trafficked in broad daylight every single day of the week, Oakland would be shut down until they figured out how to deal with it. But because it is Black girls, and I'll go as far as say dark-skinned Black girls,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
nothing. I don't want to invisibilize the work of Regina Evans or Sarai or Shade or Missy. I don't want to invisibilize those folks. But given the enormity of this problem, the fact that the Oakland is famous, and I was born and raised in Vegas, so I'm from the other big city on the circuit, right? But it looks very different there. It looks very, very different there. But we are literally famous because of the track, because of the blade, actually, right, is what we call it in the town. And I don't hear not a single solitary politician saying or doing anything about saving Black girls. And what does that say to them? What does that say to a 13-year-old girl who knows that
I think Kat might have froze. However, I want to stay in that same place.
on that clock 6 hours a day?
We lost you for a second there. Driving home the point though, you see, I suspect there's some sort of narrative here that has a set of expectations for Black femaleness. How do the intersections, or what that does psychologically to Black females? How does that intersect with other triggers like lack of control, the exposure to violence, and as both of you have brought up, the use of violence as a means of survival? And so when one allows oneself to be commodified, if that gives you a modicum of control in a world where you feel like you haven't had any control, can you talk about these intersections that are unspoken contributors to the public narrative of what Black femininity is and how that then affects young Black women?
You know, I think sort of falling back on or piggybacking on what Kat was saying around, and what we're all kind of saying around this being invisible. You know, I think that to try and answer some of what Kat was saying around how is it that we can see anytime, day or night, or girls up and down International, we see them. So if we see them, law enforcement, everyone sees them. And they're there every single day, day or night. And it feels like no one's doing anything about it. It feels like there is not enough of a strong enough response to actually end it. It also affirms this invisible nature of the problem. These are girls that don't matter. That's what we're saying. That is what's being said. These are girls that don't matter. So that means that they're invisible. So again, there's another system, another space, another place where we're saying Black girls are invisible. It also normalizes the behavior. It normalizes the abuse against Black girls. It normalizes being able to go to that area and buy a girl for sex. Normalizes that. It says we are saying that it is okay by being able to see that every single day. And the harm that does, the harm that it does to Black girls' psyche over time, to see that day in and day out, what that says. My medical student and I, a few years ago, with her thesis work, conducted a study talking to girls, mostly Black girls affected by exploitation, about their experiences and their choices around exploitation, knowing that exploitation overall is not a choice, but trying to understand how they frame and how they see their exploitation. And some of them specifically said that they know that they're choosing this harmful, or walking into this harmful situation to be able to center safety in another area of their life, to have basic needs met. Although we know that the majority of income that's gained from an exploitative act, that young girl will never see that. But being able to see just an iota of that income, choosing that as an autonomous act to care for themselves, knowing that they're putting themselves in a violent, harmful situation. And I'm not speaking to the psyche, I'm speaking just the act alone. So we know that girls are exerting their autonomy. They are exerting, even in these exploitative relationships and in this nature of exploitation.
Yeah, and I think that balancing that piece and understanding how young people make meaning in their lives, right? And so how young Black women and girls make meaning in their lives, make choices in their lives, being able to really understand that and to meet girls and young women where they are on that, I think is really important. And then at the same time, understanding that we all make choices that can complicate our lives, right? And so that's as true for them as it is for anyone else. And we can kind of zoom out and see the ways in which some of these choices might complicate their lives by virtue of, to get back to Kat's point, who they are and where they are, right? That the consequences for them are much different than the consequences from, experienced by girls in other settings. I also was thinking about the way that what's also made invisible is how state violence contributes to girls on the blade, Black girls on the blade, and thinking about how decades, centuries, but we think decades of disinvestment and exclusion of Black neighborhoods in Oakland and in the Bay Area region create that kind of precarity in the conditions, in the context within which girls are making these choices. And I think we also, so when we see young Black girls on the blade, we have to see that violence too. Like, we have to see that backdrop as well. I'm thinking about when I was doing some work in this space in Oakland several years ago, hearing that part of what was happening, and other folks will know, may know better than me, was that the crackdown, by virtue of of war on drugs and all that, but targeting and the policing of drugs, right? Back when marijuana wasn't legal, right? And that kind of policing shifted markets, right? And influenced the market for Black girls for CSEC. And so thinking about the ways that policing and police responses are also implicated, right, in what we all see, right, when in this space. And so all that's to say is to think about the way that state violence is also showing up, which then complicates any effort to call on the state to address the problem, right? Because why would they?
So there's a
Wait. I actually, I'm gonna follow up. Sorry. And my daughter just spilled water all over my computer. So who knows how long I'm actually gonna be lasting here. So I'm gonna get in this question because you may be doing the rest of this by yourself. So I've been working with the CSEC population 7 years, I think now, and particularly with Black girls. And I believe in the decriminalization of sex work. I'm probably the only 2018 mayoral candidate that went to the sex workers rally. And was shocked, actually, when particularly white sex workers came for me about playing savior to 13-year-old Black girls. And so I wanted to, and I do realize that I set that up with bias. That I'm allowed is my shit. But I want to open up that conversation because I do think that we have to find a way to do both, right? We have to find a way to decriminalize sex work and protect sex workers, and protect Black children who, I don't give a fuck, cannot consent at the age of 13. I will leave it there for y'all to pontificate while I drain water out of my computer.
And so the question is, draw the line between the choice of an adult woman who chooses to be a sex worker and a child below the age of consent who is sold like a piece of lumber without consent and without profit. I call one a slave and I call the other one, a woman plying a trade. Is there a difference here that can be pulled out by either Nikki or Aisha here? What's the difference between a sex worker and a trafficked child?
The line you draw seems quite reasonable to me. And so of course, I mean, that is a clear, bright line. It's a clear, bright line. And what I'm hearing in Kat's comments is that Kat is involved in a different project than some of the activists who are more concerned with adult sex work. And she said it was a white woman who or a white person who approached her on that. What that says to me is that these are different projects, right? So if as a Black woman, right, as an elder Black woman, you have a commitment and obligation to the safety of Black girls, right? And so that's the project that I see Kat's engagement, right, with trafficking on the blade. That's how I hear what she is saying. Her concern is motivated by that, It's not motivated by this other conversation on, and it's a longer, it's really valid and nuanced conversation on sex work and should it be decriminalized and all of that exists there, that is worth holding and engaging in. But it's not exactly the same as trying to do the work that Black women historically have done for Black girls to keep Black girls safe, right? And so that just came out to me in listening to Kat's comment. They are, maybe tangential, maybe overlapping projects, but they're not entirely the same project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, and I think that there's a way to center and honor both. I absolutely do, because I am there. I certainly adamantly am against the exploitation of young people, of Black girls and boys. And it doesn't just stop with them being a minor. Anyone who is being coerced or forced, or either physically forced or coerced, or just by nature of their age, to engage in sex acts for anything that they might need, that's exploitation. I'm adamantly against that, and also adamantly for women being able to have 100% autonomy over their bodies, and making their safe choices and their independent choices for their lives. And I think we can hold both of those. And I think it's very important to understand how we do that, and to know that although we have the definitions in our minds, that sometimes it blurs in reality. And so we may need to approach each individual. We have to approach each individual in a different way, and see, or make sure that people are making their own choices, that adults are making it, because adults can be trafficked too, making sure that adults are making their own choices, affirming that, while we hold both, because we certainly can hold both. I think about folks who might just have a kind of a hard stance on either you're trying to save someone or you shouldn't be doing this. I think about it in the same way as sometimes how the choice movement and the anti-choice movement sit. And sometimes with folks who are who can be anti-choice are maybe just only thinking about that pregnancy, but not what happens afterward. Like, are we now, if we're so against ending pregnancy, are we also supporting families? Are we also supporting sort of what has to happen to have a family that can thrive and be healthy? So I think that as we hold the definitions in our minds, knowing that there is nuance and supporting children and adults in that continuum of a nuance to make sure that folks are safe and healthy.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring in a question from the audience. Oh, well, let me actually first welcome all the people that came in at 7 o'clock. We learned at 6 o'clock when we were starting that the Zoom invitation link said 7 o'clock. So apologies for that. We are recording this, however, and we will make it available to the public. So you'll be able to see some of the brilliance that you weren't present for, but we've still got 45 minutes of brilliance from these two women. And so I want to bring in a question from the audience that says, I am curious to hear someone speak to buyers as a stakeholder needed for violence prevention from a public health lens. How do we engage that population or people at risk of buying? Would love to hear from both of you. You all decide who starts.
I think it's hard to have a real community response when we have folks on the margins, on the fringes. I think that in order to have a holistic response and approach to really addressing and ending CSEC, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, we have to address the folks who are being exploited. We have to address the exploiters, often exploited and exploiters. Those are the same, those could be the same people sometimes, and they certainly can come from the same communities, the same background, they're affected in the same ways. And the way that it manifests might be different one day, and it might be the same the next. We also have to address the buyers. So it has to all be addressed. It has to all be healed, and we can't shy away from really creating a healing, targeted healing approach for buyers and potential buyers. We certainly do have a punitive approach, and we have put in more punitive measures, and I can understand where some of that comes from, but that's not the only, we can't stop at that space for buyers, because just by enacting stricter measures and folks having to go on to lists and purchaser lists and all of that, it's not going to stop the demand. We really have to address folks who are active in the demand to help to stop the demand. That is a part of a community-based holistic approach to really ending the sexual exploitation of youth and of adults, but we're talking about of youth.
Do you have something you'd like to add to that, Dr. Jones?
No, I thought that was right on. I mean, as I was thinking about this moment when I was interviewing a young woman who was sexually exploited and trafficked in Oakland some years ago. And I'm thinking about what choice meant for her and what she needed. So as I'm interviewing her, she says to me, how do I get it off? And I was like, what do you mean? How do you get it off? And what she meant was, how does she take down the videos or the pictures, I should say, that had been posted of her on these sites, right, on the internet, right? And so even though she herself was trying to heal, right, and to move into a different space, she knew that this past, right, existed, in this documentation of her engagement with this life that she no longer was choosing, right, existed. And so, I say that because in part, I mean, it was just a very powerful memory, but the question also makes me think about how large this market is, right? And how much work goes into maintaining it. And so when I think, just in a small way of the interventions from where I enter into this conversation, it really is, to go back to what Dr. Mays was saying, it's about those who are exploited and thinking, and none of these categories are mutually exclusive. But thinking about young people, young Black people who are in this system, either as the one doing the exploiting or as being exploited, and how do we prevent them or offer them the kinds of resources so that they are not having the kinds of memories or experiences like the young woman that I was interviewing.
So I don't know, maybe I'm just triggered that, because the question struck me as another silo of work. People, the way I'm interpreting the question is, how do we disrupt people from wanting to buy 12, 13-year-olds to have sex with them? And this is we know that we're talking about Oakland, but this is a global phenomenon. And so if we are having a conversation about the safety or disruption in the violence against the bodies of Black girls and Black females, for me, and I am open to someone saving my soul if it is airing here, I'd like to keep the conversation about how we save those girls. It's a whole nother conversation about how we get grown people to understand it's not okay to buy kids to have sex with. And so there needs to be some disruption But I think that I am always triggered when there are a group of victims who then need to save a bunch of other people in order for them to be saved. Can we just say the babies? And like adult sex work is a different conversation than I think the saving and the disruption of adults who want to engage in sex with children is a different conversation than young Black girls getting to be safe in their bodies and having the wherewithal to find different ways to survive. And I think our responsibility to them, maybe for me, that's a part of the thing. Can we just save them? Can we work on saving them? And then if we have time left over, we can go and talk to people who don't understand that children get to be children. Yeah, can you give us a new question here?
I don't know if I'm on. Is my microphone on?
It is. Can you, Jardine, can you please put your question
Video?
can you put your question in the chat and we'll get
Gotcha.
to it.
Gotcha. Okay. I joined late. Sorry. Okay.
You're good. You're good. Thank you. And that's actually a great reminder for folks who have questions for Dr. Mays or Dr. Jones. Please place them in the chat. Ayodele and I are tracking that, and we will get to them.
Can I just make a quick comment to that?
For sure.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dr. Ayodele, and my my heart just is like, my heart is with our girls. My heart is with our girls, the girls I see every day in my clinic who are living and have been living in lives in this circle of exploitation for many years, and who I think about all the time. And I would say that one of the reasons I started thinking about the buyers in this circle is because sometimes they are actually part of, they are part of this community. They are part of and when I say community, I mean the community of the circle of exploitation. And not just because they're buyers, because sometimes those buyers live in the same family as young people who are being exploited. Sometimes they live in the same house of a young person who's being exploited. They may not be purchasing that young person in the house. Sometimes they are, but they also might be engaging in exploitation or engage in purchasing and going out to have sex with young people, with young folks who are in the same age of people who live in their household. And so as I've had more conversations just with other community agencies in Oakland that also do this work, and sort of thinking about, we won't be able to really support the safety of our Black girls without addressing the buyers, because the buyers are not only buyers, they're uncles, they're fathers in the house, they're community members, and I would like to also hear from them. Like, we need to call them to task too. What is it? How is it that this can stop amongst your community, amongst you as buyers community, knowing that the buyers and young folks who are exploited are often side by side, and not just through a transaction, not just in a transaction.
There's two places that I want to go from here. So I'm gonna start with the first one, and that's the adultification of Black girls, right? That our girls are not seen as children. Our children are not seen as children, right? That's why a 14-year-old in a park playing with a toy gun, something that boys across America do every single day, can be gunned down like an animal in broad daylight by law enforcement, right? Because they didn't see a child with a toy. They saw a man. They saw a suspect. They saw, I don't want to say man, because that would intonate some level of respect. an animal. Micaiah Bryant, you know, on the day that Black people across the world were in the process of exhaling because I don't block that man's name. Derek Chauvin was you know, being found guilty for the murder, for the public execution of George Floyd. We were stopped mid exhale, only to inhale in horror because a 16-year-old child was shot 4 times center mass. And one of the things for those of us who were paying attention, and actually I was heartened because of the swift response, and maybe it's just because of who and what populates my social media feeds, there was backlash to, but she was called a woman, right? That her childhood was immediately erased, not just by law enforcement, but by almost every single major news network. And so I'm wondering if both of you can talk about the adultification, which then I believe leads to the sexualization, right, of our girls, of our children.
You know, I think you just laid it out. You know, I think, you know, so we know that Black children have not been guaranteed a childhood. We know that Black girls have been excluded from any protection that femininity offers. And we see the consequences of that when it comes to police violence, when it comes to policing in schools, and when it comes to sex trafficking. And so, you know, in thinking, you know, about, you know, again, this theme of invisibility and when and how do Black girls become visible, and in particular in thinking about their sexualization at very young ages, one of the kind of turning points is the entrance into puberty, right? And you hear from girls' narratives, and you can read this in novels, that there's a feeling as if you are now seen as different, right, through the eyes of the people around you, and that difference comes with a consequence. That difference opens up vulnerability. When I think about some of the work I've done with young men about in their experiences with policing, and thinking about this difference, the same kind of difference is noticeable around that same age, right? And so they may talk about getting stickers from police officers. You know, you might see, or I've seen in the work I've done, you know, officers, you know, try to approach very young kids differently, but once they're 12, 13, 14, right, they look much different, and they're open to violence in a way through the eyes of the police officers, and they're open to violence in a way that is different. And yet we know that 6-year-olds are put in handcuffs, right, in schools, right? And so, you know, I think that, you know, contending with the, you know, what it means to create and construct a Black childhood is the work that so many of us are involved in right now, for our own children and for other children. We have not yet had that in the history of this nation, a space where Black children can be children.
Dr. Mays?
Yeah, I completely agree, and our girls know it, and they know it. They know that they are being hypersexualized. In the work that we've done with Black girls in the Bay Area who've been exploited, and just kind of talking to them about their experiences. And we were really talking about their experiences with healthcare, and what came out of that were all these structural challenges and obstacles and inequities that they live through that affect how they show up to healthcare, how they can receive healthcare. And one of the major themes that came up was a hypersexualization of Black girls, and they knew it. We have one quote from a young person who says this really popular quote from back in the day, that it must be jelly because jam don't shake like that, or jam don't jiggle like that. And she talked about getting off the school bus in a school uniform in middle school, and an adult man saying that to her, and then sort of how she felt about that, like, you're going to degrade me like that, like I'm a child. So they know it. And I think that it also contributes to this sense of invisibility You're seeing me as a commodity, as an item, rage, and also their sense of self. So then we think about that. So now what's the pipeline? What's the how that contributes to the prison pipeline? How that contributes to their feeling, how they feel about themselves and how they're seen by others, how their sadness, the anger, which is really sadness, and how that is perceived and approached by others, by law enforcement. So that all contributes to how Black girls are penalized in this country.
And can I just follow up, because so Dr. Mays and Dr. Nzinga's provocation is pushing us to really engage with what I think of as the unfinished Black feminist project, right? So Dr. Mays, you brought it up a couple of times. Who are the buyers? Sometimes the buyers are in the family, right? Who's calling out the young Black girl coming out of the bus? Sometimes it's an older Black man. So how do we talk about that? How do we talk about the experiences of violence, various forms of violence that are experienced by Black girls and young Black women when that violence is done by Black men? That seems to be a question, right, that is living in this space, right, that we have to contend with. And we're not the first to do that. We think about, the Combined River Collective and just going on the history of Black feminist thought, right? But this is, I think, a central issue. And it's just like, it's right there on the surface. So I just wanted to see if we wanted to open up space to engage with that.
I'm glad you did, Dr. Jones, because it's a good segue to where I was trying to figure out how to get. And right, this is when our work gets hard, right? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where all of the fancy foot conversations about abolition get really real. Because how do we talk about the buyers? How do we talk about our uncles, right? So I'm a sexual assault survivor. My uncle assaulted me as a child. How do we, what is our new paradigm for that if it's not incarceration, if it's not retribution, if it's not revenge? That's why for a long time, I wouldn't call myself an abolitionist, because I didn't give a where you put the pedophiles. You could put them underneath the jail and give them a piece of bread once a month, as far as I was concerned, for a very long time, right? Mm-hmm. And it was through my own work. The work that I had to do had nothing actually to do with Ron Polk, right? The work that I had to do very much with Cat Brooks. And so, yeah, I would like to open that up. And Dr. Nzinga, I'd like to hear your thoughts too, right? How do we have conversations about the world that we say that we're trying to build? When is this real?
I think the first thing you have to do is put that response about buyers in a larger container. Yes, the closest container to us is the uncles, and for me, it was a stepfather. My mother's stepfather is the man who treated me as an elementary school child, like a grown woman. And I don't have any sympathy for that particular man, but I have to sensibly ask the question, what does it do to dislocate a whole group of people from possession of their body? Black men have not always had control of their bodies either. Mm-hmm. You think of what happened to Black women during slavery. Let's not be naive. Children of all sexes were used by everyone, male and female. So to be socialized sexually in the West, and this is a global problem, but to be sexualized in the West and in the context of slavery, where a large part of it, you have to look at like you look at rape. It didn't have anything to do with the efficiency of slavery. It had to do with the complete domination, control, and the dehumanization of the property that was there. And this thought of girls being property still exists. The thing of not owning your body only being there to serve, to bring pleasure to other people, a thing that denies you not only your childhood. They told us Black women don't feel pain. We don't care about what happens to our children, So this complete disconnection with body and the complete disconnection with the ability to simultaneously make yourself safe and then to make those you love safe. And the rage that you talked about, what happens when you carry all that rage around. And we know that a lot of people who are now in the throes of pedophilia were at one time a victim of pedophilia. And so it is complex because, first of all, you have to put it in a larger container than just Black men. If you're going to talk about it here in America, you have to talk about how did that become a part of male socialization? How is rape culture real here? All that stuff is interconnected, you know? And then again, I do still believe that there is somehow a separate conversation to be had about how we do take back the sanctity of Black femaleness, where it wombs and yonis and children and maturity and babies and the right to make a decision and to keep things safe, families and little people. How many mothers who are survivors themselves are hypervigilant about keeping their daughters safe, and so they police their bodies in a way that gives them some sort of psychological guilt about being female. So again, the thing of bashing the person who suffers or needing to save everybody, escalating out, it gets interesting, and it all touches, but you got to start somewhere, right? So what are we responsible for here? I think that's another Black woman thing. What are we responsible for in this room? And is it okay if we take this narrative and say, in this narrative, in the story we telling, we're responsible for the safety of Black female bodies, and that's what we're doing today. Yes, more work to be done, but there's more people in the world than us too, right? I'm gonna let someone else talk.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that I think when we're talking about I want to center just the community healing that needs to happen, and that community healing can also happen in containers. So I do think that it is on purchasers to do their healing. So I don't know how to heal. I don't know what the deep issue is around folks who are purchasing young people, but purchasers do. So we need to also have these purchasers lead that work, that healing work. The work needs to be done, and I agree that it can't be led from the outside. Maybe folks who are not necessarily purchasers or don't identify in that way can be a part if they decide to be. But I do think that leadership, for so many reasons, because that is that lived experience, and they understand from that lived experience, but also for taking ownership of the harm and the violence. If you have folks coming from another vantage point who are trying to tell people that they shouldn't be doing something that they're doing, how is that putting any of the responsibility on that community that has done harm? So I do think that we need folks who are purchasing and having sex with young children to lead that work, to help to lead that work. I also think that, again, we see that this is a multifactorial, devastating issue that young girls, Black girls can carry around with them for generations. If we don't do something, if something is not done about it, and using these containers to center community healing, so that one major group that we know is affecting this the state of exploitation is sort of not left out dangling. And I totally agree with you that might not be our work. And I do think that that's something that purchasers should be leading, is their work in that way.
Dr. Jones, you opened this book.
I was really curious in the responses, and I thank you for sharing, sharing your experiences as well. And thinking about, to the Dr. Nzinga's point, is that can't we just hold this space for us? And Dr. Mays just said, yes, we can, right? And that can be part of the larger project of healing. And I think it can be instructive. So when I think about the work that I've done to understand the violence that's done to Black women and girls, that helped me to actually reframe how I understood police violence. And so because of all that I knew about how Black girls navigated threats of sexual violence, sexual harassment, gender specific, intimate violence, because I knew the structure of that violence so well, when I started talking to boys and young men about their experiences with the police, when they would tell me things like officers would shove their hands down their pants, or like a young man told me, I grew up with their hands down my pants, referencing the kind of strip searches that get done. When a young man is protesting because he was taken to the local police station and strip search, I don't see that just as policing, right? I see that structurally identical to the sexual violence that Black women and girls experience. But we don't talk about it that way, even though that analysis is there, right? That enlightenment, that understanding of how violence operates and the consequences of it are there because we have this body of Black feminist thought. Now, we don't think about it that way because of part of what brings us here is because we typically center the experiences of Black masculinity and manhood in conversations around police violence, as if the primary injury is to manhood and the primary solution then is to make Black men more manly, or whatever that may mean. Instead of potentially, and Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins writes about this as well, using that understanding of how violence operates in the lives of Black women and girls to illuminate how police violence is operating across the gender spectrum. But if we think about the experiences of Black men, could Black men and boys then look over there and say, whoa, this is a whole nother way for us to understand our experience? And so that we're not organizing around Black manhood or injury to Black masculinity, but to go to Dr. Nzinga's point, we're organizing around our right to bodily integrity. Do we have control of our own bodies? Why is it that by virtue of being Black in this country, we historically have not, right? And so I do think that doing that work, that yes, we do that work, and we know that that work shines a light, right? And can illuminate the experiences of others.
One more place that I'd like to go, and I do want to encourage folks, we are coming close to the end of time. If you have questions for Dr. Mays or Dr. Jones or Dr. Nzinga or me, please put them in the chat. The world was aghast when Daniel Holtzclaw, right, the police officer who ended up being found guilty on like 60-something counts of sexual assault. It stunned me how stunned the planet was, right, that something like that could happen. But the reality is, and this is what I'm hoping one or both of you can speak to, that the primary way actually that Black women experience state violence is actually through sexual assault at the hands of law enforcement. And if you could maybe do some historical tracing of that for us, that would be dope. I think we look at you, Dr. Jones. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just finished. So yes, absolutely. And then to kind of piggyback or to extend what I was just saying about the experiences of violence, sexual violence, women, and thinking about routine policing as a form of sexualized violence, we also know that Black women and girls are exposed to the same kinds of violence at the hands of law enforcement and disproportionately exposed to sexual violence. And you know, that history is deeply embedded in the lack of protection that has existed or hasn't existed for Black women and girls, period. And so the idea that one, law enforcement would protect Black women and girls from this violence is not one that's been borne out by the present conditions. And certainly we have a lot of data and evidence that shows just the opposite, right? That Black women and girls are more vulnerable. And so we have, you know, so part of the work, I think, and thinking about the work of the Three Black Girls Theater and telling these stories is to tell those stories, right? To break the silence that's not quite a silence, because many of us know about it, right? It's just not out there in the mainstream in the same way. And so I think, you know, pushing on that is really important. And then I'm also thinking about a scene that I write about and thinking about this like vulnerability of Black girls to policing and to violence and how that operates and intersects. And so, you know, it's a scene from a video recording of a police encounter in the neighborhood where I was doing field work. And a police officer has a young Black woman in handcuffs. There was a fight or something, she's in handcuffs. So she's in handcuffs for a fight because now Black girls are in handcuffs for fights in a way that they may not have been in a different period, an earlier period. And she is being paraded, right, through the complex. And on the stoop is a group of young Black men, right? And as she's being walked by the police, right, through this space, the young Black men are calling out at her, right, catcalling her. One young man says, I wish I was locked up with you. If I was locked up with you, you'd be locked up for real, right? So an innuendo, right, of sexual violence. But, and also an innuendo that's rooted in an understanding of his own vulnerability to being locked up, right, to being in that same kind of position. And what is striking about that scene is that in that moment, she is literally in the hands of the police. And what does being in the hands of the police make her? It make her in that moment, it makes her more vulnerable to sexual harassment and sexual violence. And that's before she even gets to the car or to the police station, which then when she is with the officer, she's certainly right in the powerless position and is open to sexual violence there. Right. And so I think it's just kind of an illustration of the various ways that contact with the police exposes Black women and girls to more violence, far more than it can protect them from that violence.
Mm-hmm. And I love your example, Dr. Jones, and I completely agree. And from some of our research here with Black girls who have been affected by exploitation, they have told us that they want protection from the police. They actually want police protection. There's this tension between fear of the police, being afraid because they know what they have experienced and what the outcomes have been, and wanting the police protection. We have had girls from our study say that they have not received immediate medical treatment or timely medical treatment because the police specifically have said to them that they know they already have a disease. They don't need to go to the hospital right now. They can wait. And so they know that their interactions with the police are not going to be ones where they are centering safety, and they are looking for that. They're constantly looking for that. We've spoken with young people who have been on international and have seen the police drive by because there's not an actual encounter happening, because they see them on the street, they see that they're vulnerable, they see that they're exposed, but they don't see that there's an encounter happening, so they just drive by. We know that our young people are looking for that protection. They know that they're not going to receive it under the current circumstances of how the police engage with Black girls, and particularly Black girls who are overtly vulnerable, who are overtly in living on the margins and visibly on the margins.
Dr. Nzinga, follow-up questions?
So where's the bright spot? Where do we go from here? What is from both of you, what is the one most impactful thing we could do to recenter the safety of Black girls and women and to disrupt the tide of violence towards them?
Well, my initial response to that is the bright spot is in the girls, right? And even when I was writing the book on violence, which was a very heavy book to write, like Black girls were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, right? And I carried that heaviness with me after I left Philadelphia, right? And moved to California, right? It's heavy. And yet, even in those circumstances, there is a creativity, right? There is a drive, right? There is this ingenuity that exists. And part of the work of us who are doing writing and rendering of life in some way is to capture that as well, right? Or not even to capture it, that seems too violent, but to hold it and hold it up so people can see it, right? To provide, some space for it. And so I always think that that's where the bright spot is. And part of the work that, and then the other work that we do, I think is we have to be engaged in the work that people have been engaged in before us, which is the work of protection and buffering and pushing back, right? And getting in the way, right? It should be our job to get in the way of the violence that's targeted at our young people, targeted at Black women and girls, right? We should get in the way, right? And disrupt that. And there are lots of different ways that we can do it. There are lots of different ways that people are doing it. But I do feel like that is one of our primary jobs is to do that work.
Yeah, and I think that we need to follow their lead in centering healing. Our girls are telling us what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and what they need. And we need to listen and use that as our platform for our community healing efforts for them. One thing we always talk about at our clinic is that we're youth led. We go to our young people first. They know what they need. They're already saying it. It's most of the time that we're not listening, or we're not really absorbing what they're saying so that we can then make those changes. So I think we are hearing from Black girls, the violence that they're experiencing, they are saying in very, very specific ways. They're using our terminology. They're using our language. Many of them haven't heard these terms of reproductive justice or intersectionality, but they're describing it. They're talking about how to then reframe and create a system that actually supports their healing. And we just need to do that with them at the lead, with them at the center, and making sure that whatever we're creating is centering their community and centering their healing. And then you have space like this. This is such a beautiful, powerful, affirming space to be able to actually talk about and really and think about what are the next steps? What do we need to be doing? So now we have all this energy. Now, what do we need to be doing? How do we take this into action? What are our action items, our action steps going to be?
They're brilliant, right, Dr. Mays?
Yes,
they're brilliant.
Absolutely. And I love your book, Nikki. I read it. I read it a few years ago, and I love it.
They're brilliant. And this is the thing, right? This is the thing, is that is Black feminist thought, what's happening in your clinic, right? It's not, the books and the articles. I mean, that's a piece of it. But much earlier in our history, that is Black feminist thought. That is intersectionality. That is the analysis that then we build upon what's happening in your clinic and how they're making sense of their lives and their problems and how they're imagining solutions.
Yeah. They have the answers. We just have to listen. They're telling us every day. We just have to listen and incorporate and have them at the helm. We can do this together, and they should be helping to lead the charge for their healing.
I was just about to let y'all go, but I do think, and it's actually something because something that I think about with you actually often. Just Jardine Clark put, it's also worth considering the marginalization of Black women and, oh, hold on. The marginalization of Black women and how much they are able to protect Black girls. And I would almost expand it to say protect Black children, right? And the weight that is put on Black women, not, to keep the roofs on and to put the food on and the lights on and the water on and keep your children alive, right? The name of the piece is Surviving Oakland, right? And the weight and the emotional, psychological, fiscal, spiritual cost of Black womanhood and keeping your children alive. If you could each touch on that, and I include you in that because your story, so much of your story, and decisions you made from what theater companies you were going to create to where you chose to live or had to live, in terms of keeping your children alive, right?
You know, and another thing that Black women, we truth tellers. And so is being the primary caregivers a lot of times. When we talk about the serving of poison cookies inside the house, because women are the ones who are raising some of these broken men, you know. The task for us is to get well as a community. There is no division between us. So one of us goes, so all of us shall go. The weight of being a Black woman at this particular moment in time is phenomenal. We did an event the other day called Black Women Wail. And when I thought about trying to explain what the purpose for the event was, it came down to being under such a constant assault until it was impossible to remember the names of all the murdered, missing, damaged people that it come across our news feed. How a lot of us thought last year was the year George Floyd died. He's not the only one who died. And there were women who died too. It's like the cost of carrying all that pain will not allow you to get up and dress yourself sensibly, get the kids to school, make sure their groceries on the table when people come home, or even to park your car in the parking place, as opposed to running it through all the buildings that are there because of the weight of what you carry. I worry a lot about the weight Black people as a whole carry. I think that it's schizophrenic inducing to have to be two people in the world. The person, at least two, the one for the outside world and the one that's the one at home that often takes off some of those masks and it's where some of the pain gets to dance. I think that it is extremely important that we function as a people. We focus on healing, our psychological well-being as well as our physical well-being. And I think some of that in many ways looks like withdrawing from agreements that we may have made, agreements that basically equate to civilization. These are the things that we will do, that we are expected to do because these things are normal. Some of those things are not normal, they're harmful. And communal sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, the ability to create safe spaces in community where when you are wounded, this is a place that you could go. Dr. Mays, I think that you have one of those places where people know when you're hurting, this place has Band-Aids, you can go there. They got Band-Aids, not just for the cut, but for them bruises on your soul, that this is a place you can lean into. I try to create structures like that where we learn how to hold one another. We create family outside of family. So even when it's uncle, it's somebody you could call, say, uncle over here, ill. You know, how do we create larger structures? There's a saying in community that seems very appropriate right here. We make us safe. How much more responsibility can we safely take on for that? And how much room can we make for one another so that we don't have to have special events, days where you can sit up and remember all the names and cry and scream and be held, and to let out enough of that packed down, compound, complex trauma that we all carrying around while we're trying to make life. So I think that if we want to be well, we need to continue like we're doing right now in this moment to try to provide those spaces and to outfit them with as many Dr. Joneses and Dr. Mayses as we can. So I'm going to tag Dr. Mays.
I was just gonna say Ashe because you definitely you said it. You said it. And I'm just gonna echo what you said around the community healing. And when I say community, and now I'm speaking community, Black women's community. So I agree with you that Black women have shouldered the burden of all of it for too long, because we had to, and because we still have to. So, and I think that in order for us to continue to heal and to feel, to be able to breathe more, we need each other. We need our community, Black women's community. So we need to help each other. And if that means having your Black women tribe of folks who you know are going to care for you and carry you, and we are healing and helping each other, so that Black women, we don't have to do it on our own, solely on our own, but we actually have that community. So I heard you say that, and that's what I was thinking completely. I completely agree with that. And having a safe space, that safe haven. I think about the space of Roots, having a space like Roots, having a forum like this, where you are in community, where you can feel safe to be, to express, to feel nurtured, to know where to go for other resources. Those are the things that Black women have had to shoulder solely for too long. And those are some of the things that have really sort of threatened our bodies, having to hold all of that on our own. But now we have this, so seeking out and having our spaces and sitting with community and being in spaces where we know we can feel vulnerable and be healed together.
Yes, and I will just affirm what both of you just said. And Dr. Nzinga, you laid it out so beautifully. And that's what we do. That's what we've been done. That's what we step into. Those are spaces we create for people who come after us. And so when I think of that space, for me, when I think about my Department of African American Studies, UC Berkeley, our 6th floor is different from other spaces in the university. But certainly what I've appreciated deeply over this year, which was one of the most difficult years of my career for sure, and just personally, just a challenging year for all of us, is being in conversation with the Black feminist women in my department, being in conversation with people in a department that is infused with the spirit of Black feminist artists and scholars like Barbara Christian and Veva Clark and June Jordan, who will be celebrating all year next year. So please get on our website and sign up And that kind of space we were intentional about creating because we knew what this year would be, right? And that has shored us up, right? And we hope that it's radiated out into the world in some ways for people who are able to tune in and watch a recording here or there. But I think that we cultivate those spaces, and that has been our experience. And so when I think about that, like, this is what we do. I think about James Baldwin, you know, his idea, and Eddie Glade writes about this in his recent book on James Baldwin, this elsewhere. Right? We create an elsewhere where we can be fully ourselves, where our spirits aren't harmed, or our spirits can heal. And that has been characteristic of our experience. The violence is not going to stop anytime soon. It's a deep project. And so we have to continue to do this work, right? Protecting our spirits and protecting, you know, the spirits of those, and creating those spaces for those that are close to us and that we care about. And so I try and hold both of those things, right? That this is, it's an ongoing, attack, right? This, and we have made this rupture, has created this possibility and released dreams, and that will have real change, right? Will have real consequences. And yet we still know what we need to do in order to keep ourselves safe. And we still have to keep doing that work.
Awesome note to close on. Dr. Aisha Mays, Dr. Nikki Jones, thank you both so much. This was amazing. Dr. Nzinga, thank you for being my partner in all things Artivist. I love you. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Please continue to follow us, follow Three Gross Theater on our social media platforms to continue to follow the work of Surviving Oakland. Again, we look to having finished product by September. We're excited to announce our next cohort, which will be led by Morningstar Galley, Bay Area Indigenous activist or organizer, warrior woman. So our next cohort will explore issues pertaining to Indigenous women. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you all in a theater sometime really flippin' soon. Take care, much love. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.